Certainly. Below is section 1 of They Sent Gods, We Sent Engineers, expanded to a full, rich essay with a minimum of 700 words. Hashtag section 1, The Myth of Gods and the Age of Belief. Since the dawn of consciousness, humanity has wrestled with the unknown. We looked to the skies, the storms, the stars, and death itself, searching for meaning. What we couldn't explain, we sanctified. What we feared, we deified. And thus, gods were born, not always out of divinity, but often out of desperation, imagination, and necessity. Ancient civilizations, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, were filled with stories of deities who shaped the world. These gods embodied the forces of nature, controlled the seasons, determined life and death. When crops failed, when rivers flooded, when disease swept through villages, people didn't ask why, they asked which god they had angered. Ra pulled the sun across the sky, Zeus hurled lightning from Olympus, Shiva danced the cosmic dance of creation and destruction. The gods were not just stories, they were structures of meaning, explanations for the inexplicable. In many ways, gods were humanity's earliest tools. They organized chaos. They gave people a language to describe the randomness of the universe. More than anything, they provided a sense of order in a world where life was cruel, short, and unpredictable. To believe in gods was to believe that there was some reason behind suffering. And belief had utility. It united tribes, justified laws, guided kings, and sanctified wars. But the gods were flawed because they were born in our image. Anthropomorphic and temperamental, the gods of old reflected the very human minds that made them. They loved, they lusted, they fought, they raged. In the Greek pantheon, divine affairs triggered human tragedies. In Norse mythology, even the gods were fated to die. These stories weren't just myths, they were mirrors. Over time, the cracks in divine authority widened. As societies evolved and humans learned to observe patterns, the need for gods to explain the world diminished. The stars moved in predictable paths. The seasons followed measurable cycles. Lightning had causes beyond wrath. The more we looked, the more we found not the fingerprints of gods, but the blueprints of natural law. It began with thinkers, curious minds who dared to question. The pre-Socratics in ancient Greece, Confucians in China, scholars in Islamic Golden Age cities, all started to wonder if the universe operated by principles, not personalities. Then came the philosophers who openly challenged divine explanations. Socrates died for asking too many questions. Aristotle proposed logic over myth. Lucretius wrote of atoms, not spirits. Enter the engineer, not just as a builder of machines, but as a destroyer of mysticism. Figures like Archimedes, Imhotep, and Hero of Alexandria weren't seeking the will of the gods. They were seeking patterns, ratios, and forces. They didn't pray for water, they built aqueducts. They didn't offer sacrifice for stability, they invented levers and counterweights. In doing so, they shifted the human gaze from the heavens to the earth, from divine will to human will. This was the beginning of a quiet rebellion. Instead of asking what the gods wanted, people started asking what was possible. The builder replaced the priest. The calculation replaced the prophecy. For the first time in history, there was an alternative to waiting for miracles. We could build them ourselves. Yet this shift didn't happen overnight. For centuries, faith and engineering coexisted uneasily. Cathedrals soared toward the sky not just as tributes to God, but as triumphs of mathematics and design. The great domes of Florence and Istanbul were not divine gifts. They were engineered by men who mastered geometry and materials. Still, the world remained trapped between two modes of thought, the sacred and the systematic. What's most revealing is that many of the greatest early engineers were still cloaked in the language of the divine. Their work was often commissioned by kings who ruled by the grace of God, and their achievements were labeled miracles. But beneath the surface, a transformation was underway. The sacred was becoming structural. Faith was being outpaced by function. As the Renaissance and Enlightenment loomed, this tension would only grow. People no longer needed gods to explain lightning or plagues. They began to rely on reason, science, and tools. The divine lost its monopoly on answers. It lost its grip on truth. And yet, the myths lingered. Even today, in a world of satellites and surgical robots, humanity still clings to divine archetypes. We still build temples. Only now they're data centers. We still worship. Only now it's algorithms, celebrities, ideologies. The gods have changed names, but not completely vanished. But a new figure stands at the center of this evolving mythology, the engineer. Neither prophet nor priest, the engineer speaks in code, designs with precision, and builds not for praise, but for performance. If the gods once brought fire to humanity, it is the engineer who gave us electricity, engines, and the internet. They sent gods, we sent engineers is more than a catchy phrase. It is a declaration that the age of unquestioned belief has yielded to the age of deliberate creation. Where once we waited for divine rescue, now we reach into the impossible and make it tangible. We don't just interpret the world, we reconstruct it. And so the battle line is drawn, not with swords or fire, but with ideas. On one side, the comfort of the mythic. On the other, the challenge of the mechanical. This is not merely a struggle for power. It's a struggle for the soul of civilization. The gods told us who we were. Engineers ask who we might become. Would you like me to proceed with Section 2 next? Certainly. Below is Section 2 of They Sent Gods, We Sent Engineers, written as a full, self-contained essay with a minimum of 700 words. Hashtag Section 2, The Rise of the Engineer and the Age of Reason. If the gods once explained the universe through parables and miracles, the engineers rewrote that story in equations and blueprints. They didn't descend from the heavens or demand offerings. They emerged quietly, methodically, often anonymously, behind the scenes of empires and under the dust of progress. Theirs was not the realm of myth, but of matter. And from the moment they picked up tools and charted the physical world, they began to shape the destiny of civilization more profoundly than any god ever had. The engineer, by definition, is a problem solver. But more than that, the engineer is a mediator between imagination and the real. Where the priest offers prayer, the engineer offers process. Where the prophet sees visions, the engineer sees systems. Engineering is, at its core, the application of knowledge to solve practical problems. Yet in practice, it is far more than this. It is a philosophy, a belief in the value of rationality, experimentation, iteration, and above all, creation. Long before the term engineer existed in its modern form, these early builders and tinkerers were already at work. The ancient world left behind marvels not just of faith, but of form. The aqueducts of Rome, the pyramids of Egypt, the stepwells of India, the irrigation networks of Mesopotamia. These were not gifts from gods. They were the outcomes of observation, trial, error, and innovation. The pyramids weren't raised by divine power. They were calculated, measured, and engineered, stone by stone. Still, these early engineers lived in a world ruled by divine symbolism. Their achievements were often swallowed into the mythos of the time, attributed to the gods or sacred kings rather than the minds who actually designed them. But behind every miracle of stone, water, or bronze was a human hand and a human mind working with the known and pushing into the unknown. The real turning point came with the rise of rational inquiry during the Enlightenment. No longer was nature seen as the unpredictable playground of the divine. Thinkers like Galileo, Newton, and Descartes showed that the universe operated by consistent laws, laws that could be discovered, understood, and used. These laws were not arbitrary whims of jealous deities, but observable truths that anyone could test, challenge, and build upon. It was here, in the Age of Reason, that the engineer truly emerged as a force of transformation. No longer confined to temples and palaces, engineers moved into cities, factories, and academies. They became architects of the future, shaping everything from water systems to weaponry, from bridges to entire economies. The Industrial Revolution elevated engineering from a craft to a world-altering force. Steam engines turned labor into energy, railways collapsed distances, and mechanized production transformed how we lived, worked, and thought. The gods promised power, but the engineers delivered it, measured in horsepower, wired through copper, and controlled by levers and switches. This was also the era in which the engineer became a cultural archetype. Figures like Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who engineered bridges, tunnels, and railways across Britain, or Nikola Tesla, whose inventions electrified the world, were revered not as mystics but as geniuses. They wielded not staffs but slide rules. They didn't chant, they calculated. Unlike mythic heroes, these engineers didn't require divine heritage. Their heroism came from intellect and persistence. They showed that anyone, regardless of birth or belief, could reshape the world with logic, effort, and a bit of ingenuity. In a sense, the engineer democratized power. One didn't need to be born a god to create something miraculous. One simply needed knowledge, tools, and the will to build. Yet this rising power also brought a new kind of burden. For all their accomplishments, engineers were now tasked with shaping a world that was growing more complex, more interdependent, and more fragile. With great power came the need for greater foresight. When engineers split the atom, they didn't just light cities, they cast shadows over them. When they created factories, they didn't just increase production, they polluted air and water. With each innovation came unintended consequences. Unlike gods, engineers could not claim omniscience. They had to confront the ethical implications of their work. Could something be built? Yes. But should it be built? That question marked the beginning of a deeper evolution, from pure builders to ethical stewards of the future. Today, engineering is everywhere, and yet often invisible. We walk on roads, fly in planes, and live inside structures shaped by engineering principles, but we rarely stop to think about the minds behind them. This invisibility is both a sign of engineering's success and its curse. Because engineers do not demand worship, their value is often overlooked until something breaks. In contrast, the gods have always demanded attention. They thrive in drama, sacrifice, and spectacle. But engineers, by nature, prefer the quiet elegance of things that work. They labor not for glory, but for function. Their miracles are mundane by design, a bridge that holds, a circuit that powers, a code that runs. And yet, in that quiet competence lies something extraordinary. Where gods ruled through fear and awe, engineers inspire through possibility. They show us that problems can be solved, that complexity can be mastered, and that we are not helpless in the face of nature or fate. They sent gods, we sent engineers is not just a boast. It is a statement of human potential. It reflects a worldview where problems are not punishments from heaven but puzzles to be solved. Where progress is not granted by a higher power but forged by human hands. The gods once shaped the world through myth. The engineers reshape it through method. And in that transformation, humanity found not only new tools, but a new kind of hope. Would you like me to continue with Section 3 next?
Certainly.
Below is Section 3 of They Sent Gods, We Sent Engineers, expanded to a full essay of at least 700 words. Hashtag Section 3. When Gods Return. The Clash of Belief and Design. For centuries, it seemed the gods were retreating. As humanity mapped the heavens, unlocked the atom, and sent satellites beyond Earth's gravity, the authority of ancient myths faded into history books and folklore. The engineer, armed with mathematics and materials, had dethroned the divine. Reason triumphed. Steel replaced ritual. The blueprint overtook the blessing. And yet, despite all our progress, something unexpected happened. The gods returned. They didn't reappear in temples or thunderclouds. They came back through new mediums, politics, entertainment, technology, and fear. They adapted, evolving with the times, more symbolic than supernatural, more psychological than pantheistic. And they returned not because they were true, but because humanity still craved what gods provided: clarity, comfort, community, and control. In the 21st century, belief systems flourish, sometimes religious, often ideological and increasingly digital. Conspiracy theories and charismatic leaders are followed with religious zeal. Technologies are seen as salvation or damnation. Billionaires are deified, their tweets treated as gospel. Artificial intelligence, marketed as omniscient and impartial, is invoked like an oracle. Trust the algorithm, we are told, as if its logic were beyond human understanding. The engineer built the machine, but society made it divine. Why did the gods return? Because the age of reason didn't erase human emotion. Rationality may explain the world, but it does not always satisfy the soul. Data tells us what is. Belief tells us what should be. Engineering can provide solutions, but it cannot ease existential dread on its own. And in a world of rapid change, climate crisis, and digital overload, many find comfort in stories, especially the kind that offer heroes and villains, salvation and apocalypse. This tension between belief and design has become one of the defining struggles of our time. Engineers and scientists build tools to enhance life, but their work is often undermined by resistance from those who prefer the simple certainty of myth. Vaccines are developed with astonishing speed, yet rejected by millions. Climate models predict catastrophe, yet dismissed by those who deny the data. Engineers craft reality through systems and infrastructure, but are increasingly drowned out by loud voices peddling unprovable truths. The core of this conflict is psychological. Gods, whether literal or metaphorical, offer narrative. They provide a sense of agency in a chaotic world. Engineering, on the other hand, offers systems and feedback loops, probabilities, and trade-offs. But systems are impersonal. Equations don't hug you. Feedback loops don't mourn with you. And while engineers solve tangible problems, they rarely provide the sense of emotional certainty that belief systems do. This creates a cultural asymmetry. Belief demands loyalty. Engineering demands understanding. One is accessible to all, regardless of effort. The other requires time, education, and trust in complex, often invisible processes. As a result, many choose belief, not because it is truer, but because it feels better. There's also a deep aesthetic divide. Gods are dramatic. They thunder, punish, forgive, and bless. They are worshipped through spectacle, cathedrals, chants, sacred texts. Engineers are discreet. Their triumphs don't come with choirs or incense. A functioning sewer system saves more lives than 100 sermons, but it inspires no pilgrimage. In this way, engineering's success often renders it invisible and therefore underappreciated. And yet, modern culture increasingly blends the two. Enter the technomystic, a hybrid figure who bridges belief and design. These are the entrepreneurs, inventors, and influencers who not only build, but brand themselves as prophets. Steve Jobs, with his black turtleneck and Zen minimalism, was more than an engineer. He was a high priest of the digital age. Elon Musk, launching rockets and predicting human-machine symbiosis, speaks with the tone of a visionary. Their companies are not just businesses, they're movements. Here, belief and engineering collide and coalesce. Technology becomes magical again, not because it's mysterious, but because it's marketed that way. The smartphone becomes a talisman. The self-driving car, a chariot of destiny. The algorithm, a silent judge. We've come full circle. Engineers now create the very myths that engineers once replaced. And yet this fusion is dangerous. When technology becomes sacred, it becomes unquestionable. When engineers are worshipped instead of held accountable, design becomes dogma. And when systems are treated as divine rather than designed, we lose the ability to fix what fails. The return of the gods is not a rejection of engineering, but a reminder that humans are emotional, story-driven creatures. We do not live by logic alone. And so the engineer must now compete, not just with failure or entropy, but with faith, fear, and fiction. This doesn't mean abandoning reason, but understanding its limits. The future will not be a clean victory of engineers over gods or vice versa. It will be an ongoing negotiation, one where engineers must learn to speak not just in formulas but in symbols. to explain not just how things work, but why they matter, to ground innovation in empathy, and to design not only for efficiency, but for meaning. They sent gods, we sent engineers isn't just a slogan of defiance. It's a challenge, because while gods inspire belief, engineers must now inspire trust. In an age where misinformation spreads faster than facts and spectacle overshadows substance, the engineer must do more than build. They must connect. They must reclaim the narrative, not by becoming gods, but by showing that humanity's greatest miracles are not handed down from heaven, but built, brick by brick, line by line, by human minds and hands. The gods may have returned, but they are not the only ones with stories to tell. Would you like me to continue with Section 4 next? Absolutely. Here's Section 4 of They Sent Gods, We Sent Engineers, fully developed with a minimum of 700 words. Hashtag Section 4, a new pantheon, redefining divinity in the age of design. The line between mythology and reality is thinner than we like to admit. We once invented gods to explain the world around us. Now we invent technologies to change it. But both are driven by the same impulse, to transcend limitations, to impose order on chaos, and to seek meaning in the face of mortality. The question we now face is no longer which god do we follow, but rather, what kind of world are we building, and who is doing the building? In a time when engineers wield the kind of influence once reserved for the divine, we stand at the precipice of a new cultural mythology. The old gods are no longer omnipotent, but we have not abandoned the idea of the divine entirely. Instead, we have remade it in our own image. Silicon Valley is our Olympus now. Its residents, engineers, programmers, designers are the new demigods. They craft ecosystems, reshape economies, and restructure how we relate to time, information, and one another. This new pantheon doesn't wear robes or demand ritual sacrifice. They wear hoodies, run startups, and write code that governs the lives of billions. Their shrines are data centers, their miracles measured in bandwidth and battery life. They offer us tools of unimaginable power, artificial intelligence, genetic editing, renewable energy, neural interfaces, quantum computing. These are no longer dreams, they are blueprints. And with each new achievement, the question grows more urgent. What moral compass guides the engineer in the absence of gods? Historically, religion provided a set of ethical guardrails, albeit imperfect ones. It offered narratives about humility, responsibility, restraint, traits necessary to wield power without corruption. In contrast, the engineer's world often rewards disruption over contemplation, efficiency over empathy, and scale over sustainability. The dominant ethos is move fast and break things, not do no harm. But we live in a world now where what is broken can include the climate, democratic institutions, or human attention itself. When a handful of engineers can design algorithms that shape elections or addict billions to their screens, engineering is no longer just technical, it is profoundly ethical. Every line of code carries with it the weight of consequence. This is where the old myths can teach us something, not because they are true, but because they understood power's double edge. Prometheus gave humanity fire, but was punished for overreaching. Icarus flew too close to the sun. Pandora, open the box. These stories are warnings wrapped in wonder. And we need new stories for this new era. We need a mythology of engineering, not to elevate it to divinity, but to ground it in wisdom. They sent gods, we sent engineers is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new dialogue. The gods came with promises of salvation and punishment. Engineers come with prototypes, patents, and progress reports. But the future doesn't need only innovation, it needs intention. The engineer must evolve, not just as a builder of systems but as a steward of civilization. So what does that evolution look like? First, it requires a redefinition of success. In the age of divine kings, success meant conquest and control. In the age of innovation, success is often measured in valuation and virality. But neither metric accounts for impact on human well-being or planetary stability. The engineer of the future must ask harder questions. Does this make life better, or just faster? Does it solve a problem or shift the burden elsewhere? Does it serve people or only profit? Second, it means embracing interdisciplinary thinking. The problems we face, climate change, inequality, misinformation, aren't purely technical. They're deeply social, cultural, and political. The future engineer must collaborate with ethicists, artists, historians, and philosophers. Not because these fields dilute engineering, but because they enrich it. To engineer is to shape reality, and reality is complex. Third, it demands humility. The gods claimed omniscience. Engineers must never fall into that trap. As systems become more autonomous, as AI makes decisions without clear human oversight, the illusion of control grows dangerous. Transparency, explainability, and accountability must become core principles, not optional values. The engineer's power lies not only in building, but in knowing when not to build. Finally, we must rethink education. We cannot train the next generation of engineers as if they are merely technicians. They must be storytellers, leaders, and moral thinkers. They must understand that every bridge they design, every chip they etch, every platform they launch is part of a larger human narrative. And in that narrative, they're not gods, but they might be heroes. If the gods sent down fire, it was the engineer who built the forge. If the gods whispered laws of the cosmos, it was the engineer who turned those whispers into engines, networks, and cities. We no longer wait for miracles. We simulate them, manufacture them, and mass-produce them. That is our power and our peril. We stand at a crossroad. One path leads toward blind innovation, unchecked, unexamined, and potentially catastrophic. The other path leads toward conscious creation, where engineering is infused with purpose, empathy, and foresight. The choice is ours. The future will not be handed to us by the gods. It will be engineered, either wisely or recklessly. In the end, the story of humanity is not one of gods versus engineers. It is the story of people, flawed, brilliant, fearful, hopeful, using whatever tools they can to understand their place in the universe. Once, those tools were myths. Now they are machines. And so, when they sent gods, we sent engineers, not to wage war, but to offer a new vision, one not of submission, but of stewardship, not of mystery, but of mastery, not of destiny, but of design. Would you like a compiled version of all 4 sections into one complete document? Approximate 2,800 plus words?